To most of the Marines, he was just Cookie, the guy behind the line who dished out mashed potatoes with a grin and cracked the same tired jokes every Tuesday. He moved like a man who'd been there forever, fast, steady, invisible in the way only background fixtures tend to be. No one asked where he'd come from. No one thought to wonder. But one afternoon, as the lunch line thinned out, a young private named Jackson leaned over the counter and noticed something strange. Tucked behind a stack of safety certificates and outdated inspection reports was a frame, old, crooked, and gathering dust. Curiosity pulled him closer. Behind the glass was a photo, worn and faded, and beneath it, a name and a medal. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in combat. Jackson froze. The name on the medal was the same name stitched across the cook's apron. Samuel Rodriguez. The man who had just handed him green beans with a joke had once faced bullets to save lives. The mess hall suddenly felt different, quieter. As word spread, young Marines began looking at their cook with new eyes. He wasn't just serving chow, he was serving history. And for the first time, they saw past the apron and straight into the heart of a hero. Welcome to the Silent Salute, where we discover the extraordinary people serving in ordinary roles all around us. Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe every veteran deserves recognition for their service, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're honored to share these stories with you. Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune buzzed with the constant activity of training, preparation, and the organized chaos that defined military life. The mess hall at Alpha Company was the heart of daily routine, where Marines gathered 3 times a day to refuel before returning to the demanding schedule of combat training and preparation. At the center of it all was Samuel Rodriguez, though everyone just called him Cookie. He'd been running the mess hall kitchen for 12 years, ever since he'd retired from active duty and taken the civilian contractor position. To the young Marines rotating through their training cycles, Cookie was simply part of the landscape, a fixture as permanent and reliable as the chow hall itself. Cookie was a small man, barely 5'6", with graying hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He moved through the kitchen with an efficiency that spoke of decades of practice, orchestrating the preparation of hundreds of meals with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. The younger kitchen staff deferred to his experience, and even the most demanding drill instructors treated him with casual respect. But to the Marines he served, Cookie was mostly invisible. They saw the food, appreciated the consistently good meals, and maybe exchanged a few words about the weather or upcoming training exercises. He was just the guy who made sure they were fed, clothed in a stained apron and a hairnet, more concerned with portion sizes and food safety than military protocol. Lance Corporal Marcus Jackson was different from most of the Marines who passed through Cookie's line. Where others grabbed their trays and moved on, Jackson was observant, curious about the people around him. It was a trait that had served him well in his civilian job as a journalist before he'd enlisted, and it was making him an exceptional intelligence specialist in the Marines. Jackson had been at Camp Lejeune for 6 weeks, working through advanced communications training before his deployment to Afghanistan. He'd eaten probably 100 meals in Cookie's mess hall, and like everyone else, he'd barely paid attention to the man serving them. Until the day he arrived early for lunch and found himself alone in the dining area, while Cookie finished prep work in the kitchen. That's when Jackson noticed the wall behind the serving line. Most of it was covered with the usual bureaucratic necessities: health department certificates, duty rosters, safety regulations, and motivational posters. Standard military decor that blended into the background after a while. But tucked in the corner, almost hidden behind a newer posting about food allergies, was a small frame that looked like it had been there for years. The glass was dusty, and the frame itself was simple black metal, the kind of thing someone might use for a family photo. Inside was what appeared to be an old military photograph and some kind of official document. Jackson's journalist instincts kicked in. There was something about the way the frame was positioned that suggested it wasn't meant to be prominently displayed, but it hadn't been hidden either. Like someone had put it up and then let it fade into the background over time. He moved closer to get a better look. The photograph showed a much younger man in marine dress blues, standing at attention with the rigid posture that marked formal military portraiture. The uniform looked older, maybe from the 1990s based on the style and photo quality. The face was familiar, but it took Jackson a moment to place it. When recognition hit, it was like a physical blow. The young Marine in the photograph was Cookie, decades younger, obviously, but unmistakably the same man who'd been serving Jackson lunch for 6 weeks. But there was something different about the Cookie in the photograph. This wasn't the gentle, self-effacing kitchen manager Jackson knew. This was a warrior, standing with the confidence and bearing of someone who'd seen combat and emerged victorious. Jackson squinted to read the document mounted next to the photograph. Age and exposure had faded the text, but he could make out enough to understand its significance. It was a military citation, heavy with official language and formal commendations. And at the top, in letters that stood out despite the fading, were 2 words that made Jackson's heart skip a beat: Silver Star. The Silver Star was the 3rd highest military decoration for valor, awarded only for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Jackson knew enough military history to understand that the Silver Star wasn't handed out lightly. It represented acts of extraordinary heroism under fire, the kind of courage that saved lives and changed the course of battles. And the name on the citation was Samuel Rodriguez. Cookie. Jackson heard footsteps approaching from the kitchen and quickly stepped back from the wall. Cookie emerged carrying a tray of fresh rolls, moving with his usual unhurried efficiency. He glanced at Jackson standing alone in the dining area and smiled the same gentle smile he wore every day. "You're early today, Lance Corporal. Lunch won't be ready for another 10 minutes. Jackson struggled to reconcile the man in front of him with the citation he'd just read. "No problem, Cookie. I just wanted to get out of the heat for a few minutes." Cookie nodded and began arranging the rolls in warming trays. "I hear your unit's deploying soon." "Afghanistan." "Yes, sir. 2 weeks from today." Cookie's expression grew more serious. "Be careful over there, son, and watch out for your fellow Marines. That's what matters most." There was something in Cookie's tone that suggested he was speaking from experience, not just offering generic advice. Jackson wanted to ask about the citation, about the Silver Star, about the story behind the faded photograph. But something held him back. If Cookie had wanted his military decorations to be prominently displayed, they would have been. The fact that they were tucked away in a corner suggested this wasn't something he wanted to discuss. But Jackson's journalist instincts wouldn't let it go. Over the following days, he found himself studying Cookie more carefully during meals, watching how he moved, how he interacted with the other Marines, looking for signs of the warrior he must have been. What he saw was subtle but unmistakable once he knew what to look for. The way Cookie automatically scanned the dining area when he emerged from the kitchen, his eyes moving in a pattern that suggested tactical awareness. The way he positioned himself when talking to people, always maintaining clear sight lines and routes of movement. The casual confidence with which he handled kitchen knives, moving with a precision that spoke of muscle memory developed through years of training. Most telling was how Cookie interacted with the returning veterans on base. Jackson noticed that Marines who'd seen combat in Iraq or Afghanistan treated Cookie differently than the newer recruits did. There was a subtle deference in their behavior, a recognition that suggested they knew something about Cookie that others didn't. Jackson began asking careful questions around the base. Nothing direct, just casual inquiries about Cookie's background and how long he'd been working in the mess hall. What he learned was frustratingly vague. Cookie had retired from active duty and taken the civilian position immediately afterward. He was respected by everyone who worked with him, known for his reliability and his quiet way of taking care of the Marines under his care. But no one seemed to know much about his military service. If they did, they weren't talking about it. Jackson's deployment date was approaching rapidly, and he found himself increasingly frustrated by the mystery surrounding Cookie. As someone who'd spent years investigating stories for newspapers, the idea of leaving such an obvious question unanswered bothered him more than he could explain. 3 days before his unit was scheduled to leave for Afghanistan, Jackson made a decision that went against his usual careful approach to gathering information. He was going to ask Cookie directly about the Silver Star citation. He arrived at the mess hall during the afternoon lull between lunch and dinner service. The dining area was empty, and he could hear Cookie working alone in the kitchen, probably preparing for the evening meal. Jackson took a deep breath and walked through the serving line toward the kitchen entrance. "Cookie, do you have a minute?" Cookie looked up from a large pot he was stirring and smiled. "Of course, Lance Corporal. What's on your mind?" Jackson glanced around to make sure they were alone, then gestured toward the framed citation on the wall. I've been wondering about that photograph and certificate over there. Is that you? Cookie's smile faded slightly, but he didn't seem angry or upset. More like he'd been expecting this conversation eventually. Yes, that's me. A long time ago. The citation mentions a silver star. It does. Jackson waited for Cookie to elaborate, but the older man simply returned to stirring his pot. The silence stretched between them until Jackson realized that Cookie wasn't going to volunteer any additional information. Cookie, I don't mean to pry, but the silver star is a major decoration. That citation represents extraordinary heroism. Why don't people know about it? Cookie set down his spoon and leaned against the prep counter. For a moment, Jackson thought he was going to refuse to discuss it. But then Cookie's expression softened, and Jackson caught a glimpse of something deeper in his eyes. Not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet satisfaction mixed with old pain. What would you like to know? Cookie asked finally. Everything, Jackson replied honestly. I'm deploying in 3 days, and I'd like to understand what real heroism looks like before I get over there. Cookie studied Jackson's face for a long moment, as if evaluating whether the young Marine was ready for what he might hear. Then he nodded slowly and gestured toward a couple of stools near the prep area. Sit down, son. This might take a while. Jackson sat, suddenly feeling like he was about to receive an education that hadn't been covered in any of his military training. Cookie began speaking in the same quiet, measured tone he used for everything else, but the words he chose were precise, economical, like a man who'd learned to compress complex experiences into essential facts. This was 1995. Somalia. I was a staff sergeant with the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit. We were part of the peacekeeping mission, but things had gone sideways pretty quickly. Peacekeeping turned into combat operations, and we found ourselves in situations we hadn't been prepared for. Jackson listened intently, trying to imagine the soft-spoken man in front of him in a combat zone. Our unit had been assigned to provide security for a humanitarian convoy delivering food supplies to refugees outside Mogadishu. Intelligence suggested it would be a routine mission. Drive in, unload supplies, drive out. But intelligence was wrong. Cookie paused to check something in the oven, but Jackson could see that his mind was completely focused on the story he was telling. The convoy came under attack about 10 miles from the refugee camp. Coordinated ambush, probably 50 or 60 insurgents with automatic weapons and RPGs. Our vehicles were disabled in the initial assault, and we found ourselves pinned down in a dried riverbed with no cover and no way to call for reinforcement. Jackson felt his mouth go dry. He'd read about ambushes in his intelligence training, but hearing about one from someone who'd lived through it was completely different. We had 12 Marines and about 20 humanitarian workers, civilians who'd signed up to deliver food, not to fight a war. The insurgents had us surrounded, and they were moving in for what looked like a coordinated assault to finish us off. Cookie's voice remained steady, but Jackson could see tension in his shoulders, as if his body was remembering the stress of that day 28 years ago. The only defensive position available was a small ridge about 200 meters from where we were pinned down. Someone needed to get to that ridge and establish covering fire so the rest of the unit could move the civilians to safety. The problem was that getting to the ridge meant crossing completely open ground under direct enemy fire. Jackson realized he was holding his breath. I volunteered for the assignment, not because I was particularly brave, but because I was the best marksman in the unit and I didn't have a family waiting for me back home. Some of the other Marines had wives and children. It seemed like the logical choice. Cookie opened the oven and pulled out a pan of cornbread, but Jackson could see that his hands were steady despite the intensity of the story he was telling. The covering fire lasted about 30 seconds. That's how long it took me to cross that open ground and reach the ridge. I took fire from at least 4 different positions, and I could hear rounds snapping past my ears like angry insects. But I made it. And then I did my job. For the next 45 minutes, I provided suppressing fire while the rest of my unit moved the civilians to a more defensible position. The insurgents kept trying to flank our position, and I had to keep moving along the ridge to maintain clear fields of fire. Cookie pulled plates from a cabinet and began setting up for the dinner service, but Jackson could tell that part of his attention was still focused on that ridge in Somalia. By the time helicopter support arrived, I'd expended all my ammunition and was down to my sidearm. The insurgents had figured out where I was and were starting to coordinate an assault on my position. Another few minutes, and they would have overrun me. Jackson was trying to process what he'd just heard. The citation had mentioned extraordinary heroism, but Cookie's matter-of-fact recounting made it sound almost routine, as if crossing open ground under enemy fire and holding off 60 insurgents for 45 minutes was just part of the job. "Cookie, you saved 32 people that day." "I did my job," Cookie replied simply. "Just like you'll do yours when you get to Afghanistan." "But the Silver Star." "The Silver Star recognizes that I did my job under difficult circumstances. That's all." Jackson stared at the man who'd been serving him lunch for 6 weeks. Cookie was continuing his dinner preparations as if he'd just been discussing the weather, not recounting one of the most heroic actions Jackson had ever heard described. "Why don't you talk about this? Why isn't this story known around the base?" Cookie paused in his work and looked directly at Jackson. "Son, the most important lesson I learned in Somalia wasn't about courage under fire. It was about what happens after the shooting stops." Jackson waited for him to continue. "I came home from that deployment expecting to feel different. Like surviving something like that would change who I was, make me feel special or important. But it didn't. I was still just Samuel Rodriguez, still had the same job to do, still had the same life to live." Cookie resumed arranging plates, but his voice took on a different quality, more personal than Jackson had ever heard from him. "The real heroism isn't what you do during the 30 seconds when bullets are flying. It's what you do during the 30 years afterward. How you treat people, how you serve your community, how you use the rest of your life to honor the sacrifice of the people who didn't make it home." Jackson felt something shift in his understanding, not just of Cookie, but of what it meant to serve. "Every meal I serve here is part of that service. Every young Marine who gets proper nutrition before deployment, every conversation I have with someone who's nervous about their first combat assignment, every small thing I do to take care of the people around me. That's how I honor the memory of the Marines who died protecting those civilians in Somalia." The kitchen timer went off, and Cookie moved to check another dish. "The Silver Star represents one day of my life, Lance Corporal Jackson. But how I've lived the 8,000 days since then, that's what really matters." Before Jackson could respond, the mess hall's main door burst open with a bang that echoed through the empty dining area. A group of Marines entered in a rush, their voices carrying the excitement and urgency of men who'd just received important news. "Cookie," one of them shouted. "Cookie, you need to see this." Jackson recognized the voice. Sergeant Mike Torres, a veteran of 3 deployments who treated Cookie with the kind of respect that had always puzzled Jackson. Now he understood why. Torres was carrying a laptop computer and practically running toward the kitchen. Behind him were 4 other Marines, all of them grinning with an excitement that seemed almost boyish. "What's going on?" Cookie asked, but he was smiling at their enthusiasm. "The Pentagon just released a documentary about Somalia," Torres said, slightly out of breath. "About the humanitarian missions in the 90s. Cookie, you're in it." Cookie's smile faded. "I'm what?" Torres set his laptop on one of the dining tables and opened it. The other Marines gathered around as he navigated to a video file. They interviewed some of the humanitarian workers who were there, the ones you saved. They've been trying to find you for years. Jackson felt his heart rate increase. This was the missing piece of the story, the perspective of the people Cookie had risked his life to protect. The video began with a simple title card, "Unsung Heroes, Stories from Somalia." The production quality was professional, clearly an official Pentagon documentary rather than amateur footage. A woman's voice began speaking over images of Somalia in the 1990s. Jackson guessed she was probably in her 50s now, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that carried a weight of experience. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chun, and in 1995 I was a medical coordinator for Doctors Without Borders in Somalia. I was part of a humanitarian convoy that came under attack outside Mogadishu." The camera focused on her face as she continued. "We would all be dead if not for one Marine who sacrificed himself to save us. Staff Sergeant Samuel Rodriguez." Cookie stood frozen, staring at the laptop screen. Jackson could see his hands trembling slightly. Dr. Chin's voice continued over archival footage of Marines in Somalia. "Sergeant Rodriguez crossed 200 meters of open ground under direct enemy fire to establish a defensive position. For 45 minutes, he held off an entire insurgent force while the rest of his unit evacuated 32 civilians to safety. The documentary cut to another interview subject, a man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in dangerous places. I'm Father Michael O'Brien. I was the chaplain assigned to that humanitarian mission. I watched Sergeant Rodriguez make that run across open ground, and I've never seen anything like it before or since. He knew it was probably a suicide mission, but he didn't hesitate. Cookie sank into one of the dining chairs, his usual composed demeanor finally cracking. Jackson could see tears forming in his eyes. The documentary continued with more interviews. A photographer who'd been documenting the humanitarian mission, a translator who'd been working with the Marines, a young Somali refugee who'd been in the convoy, all of them telling the same story from different perspectives, all of them crediting Samuel Rodriguez with saving their lives. But it was the final interview that broke Cookie's composure completely. The subject was an elderly Somali man speaking through a translator. The subtitle identified him as Ahmed Hassan, village elder. The American Marine, the translation read, he saved not just the people in the convoy. He saved my village. The food they were bringing was the difference between survival and starvation for 300 people. Without his courage, we would have lost everything. The camera pulled back to show Ahmed Hassan standing in front of a thriving village market, children playing in the background, evidence of a community that had survived and prospered in the years since that day in 1995. We have never forgotten the American Marine who gave us our lives back. We named our school after him. Our children learn his story so they understand that heroes come from all nations, all peoples, all faiths. The documentary ended with a simple message. Staff Sergeant Samuel Rodriguez was awarded the Silver Star for his actions in Somalia. His current whereabouts are unknown. The people he saved would like to thank him. The mess hall was completely silent except for the hum of kitchen equipment. Torres and the other Marines were staring at Cookie with a mixture of awe and pride. Jackson felt like he was witnessing something sacred. Cookie wiped his eyes and looked around at the faces watching him. I had no idea they'd been looking for me. Torres leaned forward. Cookie, there's more. The Pentagon wants to arrange a reunion. Dr. Chun and the other survivors want to meet with you. They want to thank you properly. Cookie shook his head slowly. I don't need to be thanked. I just did my job. Maybe, Sergeant Torres said, but they need to thank you. And maybe we need to hear their stories too. Jackson understood what Torres meant. Cookie's humility was admirable, but the people he'd saved had carried his story for 28 years. They'd built their lives on the foundation of his sacrifice, and they deserved the chance to express their gratitude. There's something else, Torres continued. The documentary is being shown at the Pentagon next week. They want to invite you to attend the screening. Cookie looked overwhelmed. For 28 years, he'd carried the weight of that day in Somalia quietly, serving meals to Marines and living a life of humble service. Now he was being asked to step back into the spotlight, to accept recognition he'd never sought. Jackson made a decision that surprised even him. Cookie, I think you should go. Cookie looked at him with surprise. Why? Because those people need to close the circle. Because their children deserve to meet the man who saved their parents' lives. Because the Marines in this mess hall deserve to understand who's been taking care of them all these years. Jackson gestured around the dining area. You said the real heroism is what you do in the 30 years after the shooting stops. Well, this is part of that. Allowing people to say thank you, accepting recognition for service, showing young Marines what real leadership looks like. That's all part of the mission too. The other Marines nodded agreement, but they waited for Cookie to make his own decision. Cookie stood up slowly and walked to the wall where his citation hung in its dusty frame. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned back to the group. All right, he said finally. I'll go to the Pentagon, but I'm wearing my kitchen whites, not a dress uniform. I want them to understand that this is who I am now. The Pentagon screening was unlike anything Cookie had experienced, even during his active duty years. The documentary was shown in a packed auditorium filled with senior military officials, foreign diplomats, and humanitarian workers from around the world. But Cookie only had eyes for the small group seated in the front row. Dr. Sarah Chun was there, older but unmistakably the same woman from the video. Father O'Brien had flown in from Boston, where he now ran a veterans counseling center. The photographer, now a Pulitzer Prize winner, had brought copies of images from that day in Somalia that had never been published. And through a video link, Ahmed Hassan spoke from his village school, surrounded by children who'd learned Cookie's story as part of their history lessons. When the lights came up after the screening, Cookie found himself surrounded by people whose lives had been shaped by 30 seconds of courage 28 years ago. Dr. Chun was the first to approach him, and when she took his hands in hers, Cookie finally understood what Jackson had meant about closing the circle. "I became a trauma surgeon because of that day," she told him. "I wanted to save lives the way you saved mine. I've operated on thousands of patients over the years, and every time I walk into an operating room, I think about your courage and try to find that same strength." Father O'Brien had a different story. "I left the military chaplaincy after Somalia and started working with veterans suffering from PTSD. Your example taught me that heroism isn't just about the moment of action. It's about carrying the weight of that action with dignity and purpose." One by one, the survivors shared how that day had influenced their life choices. The photographer had spent his career documenting humanitarian crises, inspired by Cookie's example of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The translator had become a peace negotiator, working to prevent the kind of conflicts that had torn Somalia apart. But it was Ahmed Hassan's words, transmitted via satellite from a continent away, that moved Cookie most deeply. In our culture, the translation read, "We believe that when someone saves a life, they become responsible for that life forever. You saved 32 people that day, but you also saved their children and their children's children. The school named after you has graduated 400 students. They are doctors, teachers, engineers, leaders. All of them exist because of 30 seconds of courage in 1995. The Pentagon ceremony concluded with Cookie receiving an updated citation for his Silver Star, along with a formal recognition from the Secretary of Defense. But he was also presented with something more meaningful, a collection of letters from the graduates of the Samuel Rodriguez School in Somalia, written in careful English by students who wanted to thank the American Marine they'd never met. Jackson, who had been granted special permission to attend the ceremony before his deployment, watched Cookie's transformation throughout the evening. The quiet man who served lunch in a military mess hall was revealed to be something more, a bridge between past and present, between service and sacrifice, between the warrior and the peacemaker. When Cookie returned to Camp Lejeune, word of the Pentagon ceremony had spread throughout the base. Young Marines who had been grabbing their meals and moving on now lingered to talk with the man they'd previously overlooked. Cookie's story became part of the informal education that happened between formal training sessions. But Cookie himself remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He still arrived early and stayed late. He still treated every meal as an important mission. He still took personal responsibility for the nutrition and morale of the Marines he served. The recognition hadn't changed his character. It had simply illuminated what had always been there. Jackson deployed to Afghanistan 2 days after the Pentagon ceremony, carrying with him a new understanding of what heroism looked like. Not the Hollywood version of battlefield glory, but the quiet dignity of a man who had done something extraordinary and then spent 30 years proving worthy of the lives he'd saved. 6 months later, Jackson wrote a letter to Cookie from Kandahar province. He described how Cookie's example had influenced his own approach to leadership, how the lesson about what happens after the shooting stops had shaped his interactions with Afghan civilians and his fellow Marines. But more importantly, Jackson wrote about a moment when his unit had come under attack and he'd found himself making the same kind of split-second decision Cookie had faced in Somalia. "I thought about you in that moment," Jackson wrote. "Not about the Silver Star or the ceremony, but about how you spent 30 years serving other people because you understood that survival carries responsibility. That gave me the courage to do what needed to be done." Cookie kept that letter pinned to the bulletin board in his kitchen, next to the duty rosters and safety regulations. It served as a reminder that heroism isn't just about individual moments of courage. It's about creating a legacy that inspires others to find their own strength when they need it most. The Silver Star citation was moved from its hidden corner to a more prominent position on the mess hall wall, not as a monument to Cookie's ego, but as a teaching tool. Young Marines would read it and understand that the man serving their meals had faced the ultimate test and emerged with his humanity intact. Cookie's story spread beyond Camp Lejeune through military networks and veteran organizations. It became a case study in military academies about the long-term impact of individual heroism. But it also became something more personal, proof that extraordinary people live ordinary lives among us every day, and that recognition doesn't diminish the value of humble service. The mess hall at Camp Lejeune continued to operate with the same efficiency it always had. Meals were served on time, nutrition standards were maintained, and young Marines were fed before returning to their training. But now there was an added dimension to the simple act of serving food. Cookie's legacy wasn't just about one day in Somalia, or even about the silver star hanging on the wall. It was about the daily choice to serve others with dignity, purpose, and the understanding that every act of service, no matter how small, has the potential to save lives, inspire courage, and create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. In the end, Cookie's greatest achievement wasn't crossing 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire. It was proving that heroes don't stop being heroes when the immediate danger passes. They continue serving, continue sacrificing, continue putting others before themselves in countless small ways that add up to a life of extraordinary meaning. This story was brought to you by the Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever discovered that someone you see every day has a hidden story of extraordinary courage? Someone whose humble service masked a history of heroism? Tell us in the comments about the unrecognized heroes in your own community who continue to serve long after their moment in the spotlight has passed. And if you believe these everyday heroes deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every story we share reminds us that courage comes in many forms, and the greatest heroes are often the ones who never stop serving others. We'll see you in the next one.